Welcome, everyone, to tonight's discussion on race and faith. My name is Daniel, and I will serve as tonight's host. On behalf of Chinese Evangelical Church of San Diego, we want to welcome our church family and also any guests who may be joining with us this evening. Back in early July, we began hosting a series of discussions on the topic of race and faith, or put another way, how we as Christians are to approach such a complex and nuanced topic through the lens of the gospel message. At that time, it felt like our country collectively had entered into a moment of reckoning on the topic of race, following the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery in February, Breonna Taylor in March, and George Floyd in May. A moment of reckoning only further emotionally amplified by COVID, economic recession, and unemployment, all colliding during an election year. It was chaotic and complex, and if we wanted to apply the wonderful truths of the gospel to our understanding of race, we would first need to learn more about race, how it has shaped our past and informs our present. As such, during our first session in July, we spent time listening to Albert and Rihanna, African American Christians who graciously and vulnerably shared about their experiences as African Americans in the United States. They reminded us how just as Christ commanded the Jews and the Gentiles to come together despite their very different backgrounds, we, as members of the church, have an opportunity right now to come together in unity and to respond differently than how the world responds, choosing righteous anger and love over vengeance and hate. We tackled tough questions such as, if the immigrant community can pull themselves up by their bootstraps within one generation, why can't the Black community do the same? We also heard from Jason Cha, Director of Intercultural Affairs at a Christian university called Westmont in Santa Barbara. Jason brought our identity as Asian Americans into the conversation. It spoke on our present reckoning on race as a country, the church's role in the conversation, and limitations on how we understand racism. He also spoke about the deep debt of gratitude the immigrant community owes to the Black community for the civil rights work in opening the door for us to pursue opportunity in America. During our second session in August, we invited Jason back to speak more about individual and systemic racism. He talked about historical topics relating to African Americans, including the Dred Scott decision, 3/5 compromise, and redlining. He also spoke about historical topics relating to Asian Americans, including the Ozawa and Singh cases, Chinese Exclusion Act, and World War II internment. Lastly, he touched on the American church's historical complicity in the racial realities of our country, and how it affects not just the practice of our faith, but maybe also some of our core theology as well. Now, given a fuller understanding of the history of topics of race surrounding African Americans and Asian Americans in this country, we entered our third session in late August with the goal of applying the truths of the gospel message within this context. Pastor Delano Merriweather from New Song Church in LA graced us with teaching on what is justice. He taught us how the Bible actually never mentions race, and that race is a social construct, human-made, engineered over time, with the goal to order, categorize, and divide us. Put another way, race is the declaration of another order, an order not from God, but it claims to be. Race has served as the justification of many ungodly events and behaviors in the name of God, such as the actions of Emperor Constantine, the Crusades, papal bulls, apartheid, and Jim Crow. However, even though race is a man-made device, we also cannot just easily dismiss or ignore it. It must be dismantled and dispelled ideologically and seen instead through the lens of the gospel. A gospel which tells us, as Delano says, to approach race through the lens of the gospel is to deal primarily with the issue of justice. I'll repeat, to approach race through the lens of the gospel is to deal primarily with the issue of justice. And the most just thing we can do, according to the Bible in 1 Corinthians, is to love God and love others. Love is the root of justice. Love is putting others before ourselves. Love is expensive. It will cost us stuff, but it is the way of the cross and the path towards righteousness, reconciliation, and restoration. As Delano said, nothing less and nothing more than the saving grace made available to us by Christ can transform humanity to a way that doesn't divide and oppress, but rather unites and loves God and one another. If you would, please join me in prayer. God, we honor and worship you tonight. We recognize that you are the true King and leader, and that you are good. We hope to trust you more in and through the uncertainties of life, as you lead us into green pastures and beside still waters. Our hearts truly are restless until they find their rest in you. Thank you for your commands to us, which are good, especially your command for us to be unified and to love one another. You never said that we wouldn't disagree with one another, nor ever get mad at one another, but rather you give us the tools to reconcile with one another. Please heal us, restore us, and guide us. We give you all the honor and glory tonight, and I ask for your presence to bring us peace. In Jesus' name, amen. As an overview for tonight, we want to include our sessions by hearing from two of our very own from CEC. We will divide this evening into 3 sections: 1, reflection; 2, response; 3, Q&A. We will start by hearing from our senior pastor, Steven Siu, who will share his personal reflections on racism, having grown up in an urban environment. We will then hear from CEC congregant Julian Joseph, who will share his personal reflections on what it's like to be Black in the context of a Chinese church. We will then shift to our second section, response, and we'll again hear from Julian and Pastor Steven on what this topic means for CEC in terms of next steps. Lastly, we will end with a time of Q&A. In terms of technical concerns, feel free to keep your cameras on through this evening. I know due to COVID, we all just like to see each other. We will keep microphones off for now, though. For the Q&A, I'll go over that as we get to that section, but you'll have a few options to send questions in the general chat so everyone can see it. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can send me a message personally, and I'll try to ask the speakers the questions. And thirdly, we'll give the option if you want to hop on the chat on video. You can do that, but it'll go through me first. Well, you can send me a message, and we can take care of that. Lastly, please keep in mind the session is being recorded. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pastor Steven Siu, our senior pastor here at Chinese Evangelical Church. Pastor Steven grew up in Oakland, received his MBA from USC, and worked for a number of years before heeding the call to serve in professional ministry. He has served at CEC for over 20 years, first as a pastoral intern, then as English pastor, and now as our senior pastor. Tonight he will share his personal reflections on racism, having grown up in an urban environment, and also what this topic means for CEC in the coming years. Pastor Steven, we're honored to hear from you tonight, and thank you for serving us.
Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel, for arranging all this. And I've been really blessed just participating and watching and learning. And also want to thank Albert, Brianna, Jason, Delano, and Julian for sharing too. So we're blessed to have all this, array of people just sharing their experiences with us. I'll be honest and say I'm not an expert on race. I am a learner here. I'm trying to learn myself. And I want to share some things with you tonight about my experience. First, I want to share a definition of racism that has been a blessing to me. It's helped me understand what it is. I want to share about my family history and racism, and then my biblical reflection on racism. I want to start with a story first. And imagine this story comes from Dr. Camara Phyllis Jones. Imagine that there's a group of people who enter into a restaurant, and they're enjoying the food, they're enjoying each other's company, they're enjoying the service there. And then as they look at the door, they see the sign that says open. And so they imagine that this restaurant is open to all as they're enjoying this. And then now imagine people on the outside, they're looking in. And so that same sign that says open on the inside says closed on the outside. And this group can't get into that restaurant. And imagine now for the next 6 months, this group tries to get into the restaurant, but it always seems to say closed. And yet they always seem to see people on the inside. And the people on the inside are always white, and the people on the outside are always people of color. That's what racism is. It's a system that advantages some and disadvantages others. It's something that's structural. And as a result of that, it saps the strength of the entire society and wastes human resources. And so if you want to hear more about this, I encourage you to go to this Radcliffe Harvard Edu, or you can click the QR. I'll also put the website in the chat. And so you can just really see this video by Dr. Tamara Phyllis Jones and David Williams, which talks more about this. And I think it's really eye-opening. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about my family history now and just how racism has affected my family from the first time when my grandfather came. This is my grandfather, Siu Kit. He arrived in Hawaii around 1894. And around that time, he didn't know any Chinese and he settled in Chinatown. And let's go on more. In 1900, there was bubonic plague that came into Hawaii from this one ship. And one person died on the ship from that, and they found 11 other cases of Chinese with the bubonic plague. As a result, the health authorities burned down the entire Chinatown, 30 city blocks. Imagine burning down 30 blocks of downtown San Diego because you found 11 cases of COVID. There were also Caucasians on that ship, but they didn't burn down any areas that Caucasians lived in. And it makes you wonder, is there some racism here? And my grandfather felt this. My grandfather also started to rebuild his business, and when he did, he couldn't borrow money from Caucasian banks or from the regular banks. He had to go to the association to borrow money. He eventually built this shop, the first two-story shop in Hawaii, and became prosperous. But what would happen to my grandfather is that he would leave Hawaii and move back to China with half of his children and leave the other half here in America. He would also renounce his US citizenship because of all the trouble and the racism things that I believe he faced here in America. Now let's go on to my father. My father also experienced racism too, and we can go ahead to the next slide. My father is seated right next to me, the third one from the left. And my father was born in Hawaii, but grew up in China and completed a high school education in China. And he served in the Korean War, spoke very good English, and then he eventually became a butcher, and he worked here at Grove Supermarket in Oakland. And I used to always think it was my dad's personal choice that he ended up being a butcher and working in a grocery store. Maybe he wanted to become like his father, and maybe my dad didn't really like studying, he was kind of lazy and stuff. And then something peculiar happened in high school where I was riding this van with some other Chinese kids who are from the church, and for some reason we started talking about our fathers, what they did. And I was shocked because everyone in the van, there was about 12 of us, all our fathers were in the grocery business. And I was going, this is strange. And then some had high school education like my dad, some had college degrees. And yet that's the only job that they could find. And it made me start to wonder, maybe this is more than my dad's preference. Maybe there was some racism going on that limited Chinese men in the 1950s and 60s to only find employment in the grocery business. What's really interesting is 10 years later in the 1970s, after the civil rights movement, there would be many young men and women who would come from Taiwan to come to the United States to get PhDs. They had a totally different perspective of what was possible for Chinese in America. And that's like my wife, May, her parents are like that. But for my father's generation of Chinese men, it wasn't like that. It was just grocery business is all you can do. Now, I want to show how I experienced racism myself, and this is, Jason talked about redlining, and let's go take a look at this. This is a map of Oakland. This is a 1935, 1940s map, and it's about redlining. It's created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and it highlights the areas that are desirable to live in and the areas that are not desirable to live in. All the green areas on this map are the areas that are very desirable, and it's the easiest place to receive a loan. The blue areas are a little bit less desirable, but they're still good. The yellow areas are considered declining, and the red areas are considered hazardous. And what's so amazing to me is that this map had a way of segregating Oakland up to around 2000 when Oakland started to gentrify and become the Brooklyn of the Bay Area. And what would happen in this map is all the Caucasians would live in, the professional Caucasians would live in the green areas. Those who were a little bit better off would live in the blue areas, and there's some Chinese in the blue areas as well. Most of the working collar, blue collar Chinese and whites would live in the yellow areas. And then most of the African Americans would live in the red areas. And so this map, which showed places that are desirable and less desirable, ended up segregating society. I put my little house there to show you that I live in the yellow area. My neighborhood, which is nicknamed China Hill, was primarily Chinese who moved out of Chinatown, as well as working class whites. Now, I want to click once more, and there's this little thing that pops up, OHS. That stands for Oakland High School. That is the high school that I went to. And all the area that went to that high school is encircled in that black dotted line. Now, I'm going to ask for one more click. This, with the brown dotted line, you see SHS on the bottom right side, that's Skyline High School. And this was the school district for Skyline High School. You notice that for my high school had blue areas, yellow areas, and red areas. You notice that for Skyline High School, it had green areas in the top left, and eventually all the areas that were yellow and red in that brown circle became green. So all the Skyline area was green. It became the most desirable neighborhood about 20 years later in the 1960s. And what's very interesting is that Skyline High School, of course, was the best high school in Oakland. And so the people who went to Skyline High School had aspirations to go to Ivy Leagues, elite private schools, and maybe UC Berkeley. In contrast, the people who went to my high school basically had aspiration to go to the public schools, UC Berkeley, Hayward State, or San Francisco State, or a junior college. So the area that you were raised in really developed or was a big factor in your college aspirations. And so most of the kids in my neighborhood primarily thought of Berkeley. We had, I think in my high school, we had 2 who went to Stanford and 1 who went to Ivy Leagues, but the rest of us, we never thought about that. I never thought about it myself personally. My family never thought about it. And so that's an amazing thing to me, how redlining can influence your aspiration for college. I want to point out something on this map too. If you look at the top left corner of the brown circle, that's actually closer to Oakland High School than it is to Skyline High School. But because of the way redlining and the school district work, that wealthy area became a part of Skyline High School. Not surprised, right? Now, to compound this matter, in my high school, I noticed that where you went for your elementary school education also had a great bearing on whether you were in the academic classes in high school or not. The kids who went to Lakeshore Elementary School in Crocker Highlands were in the blue area, the places that were a little bit more wealthy in our high school district. The kids who went to Cleveland Elementary School, where I went to, also did pretty well. The kids who went to Franklin Elementary School, Garfield Elementary School, Fruitvale Elementary School were all in the red areas. And these were areas where primarily African Americans lived, and many did not take academic classes, just very few. And so the area that you grew up in, if you grew up in blue and yellow and you went to Oakland High, you had a greater likelihood of going to college. Whereas if you grew up in the red area, the likelihood of you going to college was a lot lower, a lot less. And this is amazing to me to think about that, you know, just like my dad's situation, I was wondering, how come my dad wants to be a grocer? Is it because that's the way he is? And then you find out all these Chinese men are grocers too. And here it's the same thing, how come all the kids who grew up in the red line, red areas end up not going to college? Is it because they didn't want to go to college? Or is there something else at work here? And I would say it's racism. You grow up in poverty, you grow up in more violence, you grow up in less academic elementary schools that prepare you. And by the time you get to middle school and high school, you're so far behind that you can't take the academic classes. And so when I step back and think about this, I realize that my family experienced a certain degree of racism, but I believe the African American community have experienced a much greater degree of racism because they have grown up in these areas which really doesn't encourage people to go to college and receive a greater education. I think a lot of us who now live in the suburbs, it's almost like we're living in that Skyline High School area where we've left we're not living in the areas that are red or yellow in San Diego, but we're living in the areas that are green in San Diego. And it really makes me wonder, as we're thinking about this topic of racism, have we exacerbated the structural inequities by doing so? And not saying that we should move into red and yellow areas, but when we ignore those areas, do we make matters worse? And so those are the things that I'm wondering about and thinking about. Now let's talk about, and this figures into what the Bible says, and so let's go to the next one, and one more. When I think about racism, there's two different sins I think about. One is the sin of commission, which is we're actually really being racist. We're oppressing people, kind of like in Exodus 23:9, do not oppress a foreigner, for you yourselves know how it feels to be a foreigner because you were foreigners in Egypt. And when we treat other races as foreigners and oppress them, then that's the sin of commission. We're actively doing that. And if we are, that's a sin. I believe that most of us are probably committing the sin of omission in terms of racism. And that's racism is, in Luke 27, Jesus is dialoguing with the scribe about what love is. And the scribe answers, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus tells them to do so. And then the scribe asks, well, who is my neighbor? And it's really interesting to me that Jesus talks about the Samaritan who rescues this Jew. And what he's trying to say is, hey, you know, those Samaritans are your neighbors. You need to love them. And if you don't, this is the sin of omission. It's kind of like what Delano was getting at, that the greatest thing we can do is love. And if we don't, then we're not obeying God too. And I wonder if many of us, we fall more into this category. This flight to suburbia, nothing wrong with the flight, but have we forgotten our neighbors? Have we forgotten about the African American communities, the Latino communities, the other ethnic minority communities that are out there that are struggling while we're enjoying our green area, the area that's doing well? And so as I think upon this topic, my conclusion for myself, and maybe some of you may arrive at the same conclusion, is that my family and I have experienced racism, but we have not experienced it to the same degree as African Americans. And through the sin of omission, I have not loved African American communities as I've loved my community. And I exacerbate the structural inequities and racism facing African Americans. And so, Lord willing, this causes me to reflect on how I can love more. What can I do? How can my heart change to have more empathy for African American communities and Latino communities? So this is just something that I've been thinking about, wrestling with, and I just wanted to share with you, and hopefully it's a blessing for you. It's at this time, I'll just pass it on.
Thank you, Pastor Steven. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Julian Joseph. Julian has attended CEC for 5 years. He's originally from Austin, Texas, where he attended Austin Chinese Church for 10 years in his youth, and later as a youth advisor. He also has a degree in Asian American Studies and identifies as Black and mixed. Tonight, He will share his personal reflections on what it's like to be Black in the context of a Chinese church, as well as what are some potential good and bad responses we can have. We're honored to hear from him tonight. Thank you for being here, Julian.
Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screens. I have some video content as well. Give me just 1 second to set up. One more second. Thanks. Can y'all see my screen okay? Still hear me? If you could respond with audio.
Good to go.
Great. Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you, Pastor Steven. Thank you, Daniel. Just honored to be able to share a bit of my story to everybody. Like Daniel said, I'm originally from Austin, Texas, but I've been here in San Diego for the last 5 years. Just a little bit more about me. I know a good number of people on the call, but definitely not everybody. So I just want to share a little bit more of my background so you get an idea of how I've grown up and what that has to do with my experience here at CEC and in San Diego. So, like I said, originally from Austin, Texas, and there I actually attended starting Austin Chinese Church starting in 8th grade. I ended up attending that church for 10 years, and 5 of which I was actually youth advisor. And then in college, I went to University of Texas, Longhorns, majored in Asian American Studies in college. And then also in college, I was part of InterVarsity, a 300-person Asian American InterVarsity chapter to be specific. After college, I lived in Japan for a little bit to do post-tsunami cleanup and missions. Lived in Korea to work with Liberty North Korea, North Korean refugees, and then later interned with Liberty in North Korea. Moved to San Diego about 5 years ago to work for a startup, a mid-sized startup called Classy. And I'm now working at a company called Salesforce. It's a bigger tech company. 5 years ago, I started attending CEC thanks to an introduction from Kevin Wang. Some of you may know him. He was actually a CEC Mandarin ministry intern. And he did that for a few years. And I actually knew him from my Austin Chinese church. So he's originally from Austin, and he came out here for seminary, and that was my connection to CEC. So I've been part of CEC for 5 years, part of Aletheia, the young adult ministry. I identify as gay and Christian. My high school friends jokingly referred to me as 100% Asian, even though I'm half Black and half white. Half Trinidadian, half Italian American to be specific. I love pizza, Muji, Uniqlo, God. Identify as male, use he, him, his pronouns. And today, like I said, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about my experience at CEC and then transitioning into our response and just some of my thoughts based on the past several seminars that we've had together. So I'm going to start off just sharing a little story about myself to give some more context. So in high school, while I was attending Austin Chinese Church, I had a friend who I was very close with, would hang out and study together. And there's one time when we were going actually to his house for the very first time. He actually called his parents. I was with him, and he called his parents to let them know we were coming over. And I heard them talk for a little bit. We were going to just study AP Calculus. And I heard him say on the phone, he's one of the good ones. And after he hung up the phone, I asked him, what does that mean? I wasn't really sure what he was talking about. And he said, oh yeah, my parents, they know about you. They know that you're Black. And I just had to explain to them that you're one of the good ones, that you're not here to cause trouble, that we're actually going to study and do our homework. And so I'm just going to share a few more things that I've heard and experienced. Some of the other things that I've been told at church, besides he's one of the good ones, I've also heard my parents don't let me date Black people. I've heard you're more Asian than me. Some of the things that have happened before is my friend's dad looked me up and down once when I asked him for a job at a boba shop, and he just told me they weren't hiring, even though I actually knew they were, but he just told me that straight to my face, that we're not hiring. some of the other things that happen, I've been stared at every single Sunday on my walk from the parking lot to service. This is after attending Chinese churches for 15 years. I've been asked over and over and over again, why are you here? By leaders and my friends. I've even been called the N-word by people I know from church. Some of the things I've heard are, I'm worried about my skin getting darker. This is friends talking about themselves and their own skin. I've heard from the pulpit, poor people like sweets. I've heard from the pulpit, this joke is explosive, so it wouldn't go over well in the Middle East. Now, these are I just shared a lot, and you might be having different reactions yourself. I do want to let you know that for my purposes, this is not meant to be a critique. I'm not trying to shame anyone. My goal is not to embarrass, but rather to continue the conversation we've been having for awareness and growth. Because really, it's not really just about me, not even just about Black people, even though I am sharing my specific experiences, but it's about all of us. Some of the other things I've heard are CEC isn't safe for my friends, so I'm not going to bring them. These are from some of my friends at CEC. I know I certainly felt that way when I brought my Pakistani Muslim friend. She's actually on the call with us, so it's great to see that she's here. But I felt that way when I had to apologize to her after she heard some things, after she came to service and we talked after. I know I had to apologize, and I felt sorry, and I felt that it was unfortunate that she never, to this day, still hasn't received any kind of public apology for what she was hearing in that service. However, I do also want to recognize most of the time, I don't believe that people are trying to be disrespectful. This is not intentional hurt for the most part. I know this from personal relationships with many of the people that have said or done these things. But that being said, it is still causing hurt. And so I want to pose that question, what exactly is causing hurt here? It might be obvious to some, but it might still feel a little confusing to others. Like, what is the actual source? How do these things translate into hurt? So just recapping a bit, this dislike for darker skin, hearing not dateable, not smart enough. That's what I heard, and I've heard many times since then when I hear one of the good ones, or not trustworthy when I think of that boba shop job, or okay to make insensitive jokes. This is with that explosive question. And so these things together, I think, are what is leading to hurt. But if I was to summarize and also use the knowledge from the last 3 sessions, I would specifically call this racial bias. And so we've talked some about racial bias, but to recap and to emphasize a little bit more, I did want to think about like what racial bias is in this specific situation. I also want to compare it and think of how it relates to what it means to be racist or racism. To do that, I actually went to a friend. Some of you might know her. She used to attend CEC. Her name's Jessica Chen. And one of the things that she said was, to not be racist today is to look at the way we are racially biased. And so this whole act of trying not to be racist or trying not to hurt others, it's this act, in order to achieve it, or at least to better ourselves in this effort, it's this act of looking at the way we are racially biased, so looking at ourselves. I also want to acknowledge that racial bias itself is complex. Racial bias in this context, I'm talking about favoring one race or one skin color over another. It's nuanced, it's complex, and it's something that I personally think is natural and normal to a certain degree, that it does naturally occur. I think I am racially biased. And so I myself, I'm sure in different ways it comes out, ways I either favor one race or skin color, either because they're like me or because they're like an experience that I've had or gotten used to. And so I think it's something that is pretty common and normal in our society, but also a little bit hard to nail down sometimes. And so that's why we're looking at it today. I also want to acknowledge that this idea that it might just be a cultural preference. And so this is a question I get pretty often. Isn't this just a cultural preference, especially talking about skin color and dating? Well, isn't it okay that there is this preference? And I definitely don't want to critique or go into the conversation of whether or not cultural preference is okay. But I do want to acknowledge that, in my opinion, cultural preference can lead to racial bias. Even if there was some legitimate reason for that preference, it doesn't mean it's something completely separate and not going to lead to racial bias. So just because there is a cultural preference doesn't mean the effects of it today are not causing hurt and they're not leading to undue bias in these different situations that I've shared. Finally, I also want to acknowledge this still may feel like a jump for some, going from racial bias to causing hurt, or maybe even going from these situations I described to seeing racial bias. That's totally okay if you're not completely tracking with me. If you haven't seen them already, I definitely recommend watching some of our past talks. They've been recorded, and we go over these ideas of systemic racism and racial bias in more detail. If you have already watched these, I'm also going to be providing some recommended resources and materials. Definitely recommend checking out. That'll be linked in the recording as well. And that's another place to start if you still want to do a little bit more learning or you want to have this conversation. I am more than open to having this conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit and transition into response, this idea of what can we do? And so when thinking about what can we do, and when somebody tells me they want to do something, which I think really does come from a good place, I usually respond with, don't try to do something, at least not initially. As much as that is a good and healthy intention to want to respond in a way that is some sort of action, I caution them from immediately trying to do something. The reason being, if it's okay if I give a little bit of a technical analogy, I mentioned I work at a software company. I do testing at scale for products and things like that. And so I kind of want to think about this from that same product lifecycle development point of view. But when we're developing products, we have this process of first learning or researching, then doing some evaluation of what we've learned, and then actually putting it out there and trying to do something with it and testing it. And then this reflecting process, and then even starting the entire process over again and going back to researching and learning based on what we've reflected. I know wanting to go to that place of doing is coming from a good place, but I caution against jumping into the doing without doing the research and learning and reflecting. These talks that we've been going through, I would say this is the learn phase that we're in. And in a lot of ways, we're still in this learning. I'm also going to talk about what it looks like to move on to that next phase of self-evaluation. If you feel like you want to do this self-evaluation, I want to give some recommendations there. But that still, as you can see, comes before actually doing and actually taking that action. Just to put out there a few things I know that some people want to do is they want to act in some way. They want to maybe go ask all of their friends of color or Black friends to share their experiences immediately in detail, or they might want to go take some action and help somebody in some situation, all coming from a good place. But without doing that learning and without doing especially that self-reflection, we may actually be causing more hurt and more harm based on not actually evaluating our own bias, our own racial bias as we go into it. I also want to look at this from the Christian perspective. Most of us are attending CEC, a church. And so this idea of repenting and reconciling, I think this looks a lot like doing that research phase and self-evaluation and actually doing. From a Christian perspective, I think this looks like repenting and reconciling. And so that's that process of self-evaluation and coming to God with it and admitting it, and similar to admitting our own sin before God. and then reconciling it between us and God and between us and other people, and actually putting that into action. But that repentance is a really important step. That self-reflection is a really important step before we get to that reconciliation. Also, along the way, we want to be praying. So, of course, be praying as we're figuring this out. If that's something you like to do, I think it really does help with repenting, with that self-reflection. And so instead, again, of looking at what can we do, and looking again at this idea that my friend put out there of looking at ourselves to combat maybe any bias within ourselves, I want to look at this question of how can we evaluate ourselves? And so this part, I actually went to a few friends, and I also thought of some things on my own. And I asked some questions about how can we do this self-evaluation. And so here are some questions that you can use to self-evaluate. These are not the only ones by any means, but this is, I think, a place to start. And some of these questions are, if I believe it exists, what do I think about racial bias? Can I do an honest evaluation of myself? Who can I ask that is different than me and might see racial bias in me? I want to really focus on that one a bit. It's not just who can I ask to share their experiences, but it's more who can I ask that knows me well and can help me self-evaluate. And then that last question, what is my reflex to someone calling me racially biased? And the self-evaluation is definitely important, but I think I want to focus also on leaders out there. Self-evaluation, I think, is the first step, but also looking at community evaluation and some questions about what can we ask ourselves as a community, especially if we're in a leadership position in the community. And some of those questions might look like, do I believe racial bias exists at CEC, at our church? What assumptions do we have about other ministries, congregations, generations, cultures? On that one, I'm reminded that our church is, and I've heard this said, something like 90% Chinese or plus, maybe even higher than that, but definitely a majority Chinese American population. So we might think, oh, everybody is just like us. There's not going to be, we're homogenous. There's not going to be that much room for disagreement or hurt. But first of all, 90% is not 100%, obviously, I'm here. But even besides that, within our community, I know some of my friends have mentioned, hey, I don't like it when somebody does a Chinese accent or an Asian accent that sounds like my parents or somebody I care about. Even though it's meant in good fun, even though it's other Asian Americans that are doing it, that still hurts me. And so to me, that suggests there are blind spots. And so some of the other questions are, what blind spots are hurting others? Who can we learn from in the church? If you're aware of a blind spot, let a leader know about it. So coming to somebody and telling them and being clear, not necessarily just critiquing, but just letting them know, helping them to become aware. And then ask leaders what they are currently doing to make CEC a safe place. And so, as I mentioned, this is a continuous process. This is not just a checkbox moment where we are just trying to do this one and done, solve racism at our church in a day or just through a series of talks. These have been very helpful and good, but this is just, I would say, the beginning of a good and healthy process that we can take. And to use a technical term again, I'll say this is continuous improvement. We use that a lot in the tech industry, that we are taking this effort of going from that reflect all the way back to learn again. Because just once we implemented something, when we've done it, when we've reconciled, it's not a moment to just pat ourselves on the back and say we're done, but it's maybe a time to pat ourselves on the back for a bit, but then reflect on what we could do better and better understand it and look for additional blind spots and use that as a launching place to learn even more and to do even better. So yeah, as promised, I also did want to share a few resources. The two at the top are ones that I've personally read or listened to myself. The QR code on the screen is specifically for this top video, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. It's put together by Manuel Acho. He's a NFL player, and he started this YouTube series where he has these conversations with, I I think it's mostly white, but an array of different individuals. He actually also is at one point interviewed by Oprah. And so this video in particular is a link to one with a worship pastor named Aaron Ivey. He's actually back in Austin at a very large church there, the one that Chris Tomlin actually used to be the worship pastor at before. But yeah, it's him and his family. He's actually adopted, him and his wife have adopted 3 children, I believe. And 2 of them, I believe, are Black and 1 mixed. And they also have a white child who's not adopted. And so it's just an interview and a conversation with them, part of that learning, evaluate phase. The next one, Nice White Parents. I'd recommend it. It's not that long. It's only about 5 episodes long. It's a podcast, but it goes through this integration, segregation process in this school in New York that attempted to integrate several different times over about a 50, 60 year period. And it shares a lot of positive, good intentions and how they don't always play out how you might think, even well-intentioned. The rest of the resources on here, these are actually recommendations from friends. Some of them, I believe the next 2 in the list there, they're actually Christian resources. So if you're looking for something on that end, InterVarsity Press, or in an essay, I believe, by somebody. And then a few others, books that are great. I know the last book, The New Jim Crow, is pretty much considered a classic now, talking about incarceration and the legal system. So if you're interested in law, it's definitely a good one to check out. But yeah, I just want to say thank you for giving me this time to share. I'm looking forward to later doing the question answer discussion section. Just a special shout out to a few people you can see here on the screen. And yeah, thank you for having me. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Pastor Steven to talk a little bit more about our response at CEC.
Thanks so much, Julian. Really appreciate that talk, and especially about racial bias, and something that we really need to take a look at our hearts about. And I think that kind of segues into this idea of why does the talk that I like to give now, real quick, is no, JJ, it's the this one. Oh, I see. The talk that I want to give is really I want to talk about 2 things right now. One, why does CEC exist? If there's this racial bias thing, is there a place for an ethnic church like CEC or any ethnic churches? And then the second is, what is the interface between CEC and racism? So I'd like to talk about those 2 real quickly. But before I do really want to thank Julian for bringing up his friend who's here tonight, a Pakistani Muslim. I really apologize on behalf of our church if anything that any of our speakers said was offensive to you. So my apologies on behalf of our church. And if you ever want to talk a little bit more about it, I'm more than happy to, but I just want to offer you that. And so I don't think anybody should ever be insulted or feel insulted from our pulpit at all. That's not the way that Christ was. Okay. So at this time, I want to just segue back into this why CXC exists. I think you've heard the saying from Martin Luther that Sunday morning is the most segregated morning in America. And so why should a church like CEC exist? And so I'm going to go through 4 real quick reasons. And so the first one is a historical reason. There's a historical reason why CEC exists. And it's much like the Bible. The church in Jerusalem in Acts 2:41, people were saved, 3,000 people were saved, and all of a sudden, this group of people devoted themselves to meeting together and a church was formed. Pretty much Jewish church was formed and remained Jewish until the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So this Jewish church existed for 40 years. After AD 70, the Jews were not really allowed back into Jerusalem. So this church became entirely Gentile afterwards. I think there's a historical reason why also Chinese churches exist. There are a few Chinese mission churches in the United States. These are churches that were started by Caucasian missionaries, and they primarily happen in many of the larger cities in the United States. San Diego is one. And so there are a few churches that are like this, but by and large, most Chinese churches were formed because the Chinese had to reach their own people. There was, in a way, a sin of omission by the majority culture churches. And I don't think anybody was trying to be bad, but maybe the thought was, well, I don't have the language ability to reach out. And I'm already really busy trying to reach my people. And as a result, many of the Chinese had to form their own churches. And so there's a very historical reason for this. I think the African-American churches was more a sin of commission, where we don't want to reach you, we don't want to do anything, so the African-American churches had to form on their own too. So there's a historical reason why many ethnic churches exist in America. There's also a missional reason. And in Romans 1:16, the Apostle Paul talks about how the gospel brings salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, then to the Gentiles. And remember, the Apostle Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles, yet if you study all his trips, he would always try to reach the Jews first before reaching the Gentiles. And this is because the Jews were God's chosen people, and so there was a theological reason for doing so. This idea that Enoch Wan, one of our mission speakers, he's the professor at Western Seminary, developed this idea of that diaspora mission, which is very similar to Romans 1:16. And this is the idea that Christians participate in God's mission by evangelizing their kinsmen on the move, and through them to reach out to the natives in their homeland and beyond. And so this is the idea that as immigrant groups come over to the United States, the immigrants reach their own people first, and then they reach maybe the second generation, and then they reach the people in the local community, and they go beyond that. And so it's very similar to first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. It's this very missional idea. And that's really how most of the churches, Chinese churches in San Diego, have operated. There's 27 Chinese churches, and they have really tried to reach the Chinese diaspora here in San Diego. In our church, we have a Cantonese congregation that has done a great job reaching Cantonese-speaking immigrants. We have a Mandarin congregation that has also reached many Mandarin-speaking immigrants. And for our English congregation, what we're doing is we're reaching the harvest field of second-generation Chinese that are the children who are the children, youth, and college students in our church. So when we reach inside of our church to witness, to disciple our children, youth, and college students, that's doing diaspora mission. That's reaching a second generation here that no one else is reaching. And the Chinese churches have been very successful at this. I was reading one statistic where 30% of the Chinese American in the United States are evangelicals and Catholics. And that equals to, and in China, it's about 6%. So, no, 5%. So it's 6 times greater here in America. And I'm just using that word Christian in a very broad way. And so you see that the Chinese Christians have been very good at diaspora mission. However, as Enoch Wan explained, it doesn't stop here. We need to think about reaching out, especially the second generation, the English congregation. We need to figure out a way of reaching out beyond Chinese. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. The third reason why Chinese churches exist is this intergenerational reason. In Ephesians 2:19, it talks about how we're no longer strangers and foreigners, but we are members of God's household. And it's this picture of church being a family. Each local church is a family. And I think all churches desire to reach across all age groups. And especially in a Chinese church, there are many natural intergenerational relationships. There's intergenerational discipleship and intergenerational evangelism. And so our church allows for this to happen. When we poll people about what they like most about CC, they tend to say we like it because it's one big family, all these generations together. We have different generations serving together in the children, youth, and college ministries. We have, because our church is intergenerational, allows us to witness to an entire family. So we have some English-speaking families that brought their parents to church who speak Cantonese, and they became Christians. We've also had some Cantonese and Mandarin parents and grandparents bring their children or grandchildren to church, and they get saved in the English ministry. So this intergenerational ministry is really important for our church, and it's one of the reasons why we exist. Now, final reason, and that's the transformational reason. A CEC exists because not to stay the way we are, but we are here to transform to reach the nations. In Acts 1:8, it says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the world." And so even though we are a Chinese church, our goal is not to remain that, but to make sure that we reach the ends of the world. And this requires a degree of transformation. What's really interesting is I'm part of this group of English-speaking and senior pastors of Chinese churches in America. And all these churches, like our church, is trying to figure out, how do we reach out beyond the Chinese? What does it mean to change and transform so that we can reach beyond our own people? And I like to use a supermarket analogy about what we're thinking about. Many of us are like, our churches are like this Chinese grocery store, that's primarily serving Chinese people. And maybe it's doing a good job serving Chinese people, and that's great. But what we want to do is become like a Ranch 99, which is this Chinese grocery store. It's a grocery store of a Chinese heritage, but it caters to a much broader market. It's able to reach beyond the Chinese to reach others. And so I think the goal of many of the Chinese churches that I know in America is to start thinking about how do we become more like Ranch 99? We'll never become a Vons, which is like basically a Caucasian grocery store with a small Asian grocery section, because we don't have that population in our church. But we can be more of a Ranch 99, which is, okay, there's a lot of Chinese stuff here, but we can go beyond so that we can reach all. So what does it mean to become like that? And so what's really neat is that there's so many different ways and so many different stories in America. The evangelical Formosan churches in the Los Angeles area have this model of a church within a church. So all their English congregations are called Harvest, and they're sort of somewhat separate, but still part of the main Chinese church. FEC, First Evangelical Church in Diamond Bar, planted their English congregation. They took their entire English congregation, planted it in a different location to be a multi-ethnic church, and called it Anchor Community Church. Chinese Community Alliance Church dropped the C in their name, or changed the C in their name to become Christian Community Alliance Church. That church was also asked by their denomination to plant in another Alliance Church, which was failing. And so they dismantled that other Alliance Church. Chinese Alliance Church planted a church in there, and then that new plant asked the old congregants to come back. So now that church is this multi-ethnic church, mix of old congregants and the Christians from the Christian Community Alliance Church. So there's all these different models out there about how to reach out. And be in prayer for us at CEC. And I think in the next couple of years, we really need to figure out what it means to reach out. What does it mean to go beyond our own race? And like Julian was saying, what does it mean to not have a racial bias here? One of the things I am wondering for myself in CEC is social justice the means in which we will transform to reach a broader audience? I really love how our people are involved in different social justice things like Ascension Lutheran. And we used to have the Achieve program and other things where we reached out in the community. And I wonder if that is what helps us to do social justice. It helps us to love others, and it helps make us a place that is broader than what we are. So I'm wondering about that for our future. But I don't know. That's an exploration that we need to do in the next couple of years and see where God leads. So final thing I want to share is, oh, that's my house that I grew up in. So if you're ever wondering what my house looked like, that's it. Okay, go back one, please. That's the high school I went to. Okay, so I want to close with this final thought. I think CEC and many Chinese churches exist, that should be no S there, exist because of the sin of omission by many of the Caucasian and majority culture churches. Not they're bad, I understand language thing, but that's history. But in the same token, where we were created through the sin of omission, I wonder if we, again, also practice, we don't love the Linda Vista area enough. I wonder if we don't love those who are not Chinese in our church enough. And I wonder if we need greater empathy, and that's one of the growth areas that we really need in this idea of just really overcoming, to a certain degree, racism in our church, is to learn to love, start even loving those who are different in our church, and to really pray about how that happens. And to also pray about our neighborhood. You know, how do we love the people in our neighborhood more? I'm wondering if after this pandemic, do I need to get to know some of the African-American churches better, or there's Vietnamese churches in our neighborhood, other churches in our neighborhood, do I need to get to know them better, and our churches get to know them better? So we develop this empathy and love, and wherever God takes that, and it's like Delano said, I mean, love is what's going to help us overcome racism. So those are things I'm thinking about and just reflecting upon. And finally, just like I share with you, I'm wondering, the more we get involved in social justice, will we transform into the church we need to be, where we reach Chinese and non-Chinese alike? So those are some of my reflections. I don't have an answer to this. I'm still thinking about it, kind of like what Julian talked about. And I think it's this process our church needs to go through to really pray. Are we too satisfied being Chinese? And if we are, shouldn't that change? Shouldn't we want to reach our Samaria and the ends of the world? And I hope we do. I hope we come to a place of saying, yeah, we need to do more. And it starts with us and a reflection in our heart, and then it moves to action. So just encourage you to reflect and think and see where we are in our hearts and how we can change as a church. So thank you again for coming to tonight, listening to Julian and I spout off. And I pray that the things said tonight were a blessing to you and gives you a little bit more color in terms of what we're thinking about here at church and racism. So thank you again.
Thank you, Pastor Steven. I don't think we got any questions in the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, ask now or forever hold your peace. But I did come up with at least one here. So, Pastor Steven, this one is directed towards you. I know we talked, you spoke a fair amount about education and how education is a big way to move out of poverty, up in society, etc. There's a lot of recent talk about how Asians and blacks who have the same academic credentials, statistically, Asians will be not admitted to colleges to the same degree. And there's talk about affirmative action. It is affirmative action. It's a hot topic, I know, in Asian communities, and I'm curious to know what your 2 cents on it is.
Yeah, so thanks for asking, Daniel. I do have some slides I want to put up here about this topic. I'd like you to look at the slide. It's really interesting. It's by the US Census Bureau, and it's about educational attainment by race, and this is talking about college. Asians are there at the top, and I think it's like 50. Let me pull up the slide beneath me so I can see, because I can't read my own slides up there. Asians are at 50% for overseas Asian and 48.3% for native-born Asians. African Americans are 25% overseas born and 16.3% native born. And these numbers kind of reflect my experience growing up in Oakland. It was primarily the Asians who went and the African Americans who didn't. And I know some people are thinking this question, saying, well, maybe the African Americans, they didn't work as hard as the Asians, so, maybe that's why. And I want to say to you, I think that's a pretty big falsehood. And I want to point out some things that even in this graph kind of starts showing you this. Look at the difference between the foreign and local born or native Black, and the difference between their educational attainment. It's almost like 9–10% there. Take a look at the Asian. The difference there is now 1.8%, and then Caucasian is about 8%. Why is there this difference? Why is it closer for the Asians and it's farther away for Blacks? And I will venture to say this is the idea, is that when you look at a lot of the Asian immigrants, we are pretty much 3 generations deep here in America. Remember, because of the Exclusion Act, many Chinese males who came in the 1880s were not allowed to have kids. My grandfather was unique. He was a merchant, so he was allowed, but the vast majority did not. And so most Asians here are first, second, or third generation. And when you come here to America, you come with this aspiration of, oh, this is a place where I can just become who I want, and education's important. And it's not surprising that 2 or 3 generations later, it's holding together. When you look at the Blacks here, or I don't like using the word Black, but that's what this says there. I like using African American. The reason why it's different is that those who are native in America tend to be 8, 9, or 10 generations versus those who just came over. And imagine during the last 200 years, you had to go through slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights. You're told that you're not smart. You're told that you're not allowed to study. College is not for African Americans. You're told that, poverty is a place for you. And so there's this cycle that I believe a lot of African Americans are forced into, which Asians didn't have to face because we were new immigrants coming over and we didn't have that generational history of oppression that the African Americans did. And that leads to the next slide. If you take a look at this, what's really interesting is that if you go for higher education, it leads to more wealth on the right side, and that more wealth leads to more higher education. And so that's why Asians within the first or second generation, they get into this virtuous cycle of higher education, wealth, higher education, wealth, higher education, wealth. And so all my kids are supposed to go to college. I was supposed to go to college. In the African American society, it was a little bit harder because, again, of racism, because of oppression, because of slavery, because of poverty. And so the poverty tends to lead to limited education, which leads to more poverty, which leads to more limited education. So there is a negative feedback cycle there compared to the positive feedback cycle of the Asians. And I personally believe that that is why you see this difference. Because I personally have met very smart African Americans, so I don't know. I don't think it's like not working hard or anything. I think it's what you experience, the trauma that a group of people experiences that leads to this limitation. So that's my view, and just something I wanted to share. And that's why, getting back to Daniel's question, and many of you might hate me for this, but I believe in affirmative action. When all our UCs are, and sorry JJ, but when our UCs are 40% Asian, that's a lot of Asians. We need to diversify a little bit more. And I do feel like because of what African American communities and Latino communities experience and how it's much more difficult for them. We should have affirmative action for them. And then I believe that maybe the Asians and the Caucasians are lumped together in this free-for-all category. And then you have affirmative action for the rest. So I don't know, that's my 2 cents. And so if you disagree, you can let me know.
Thank you, Pastor Steven. I spoke with Albert about this recently as well. Albert was our guest during the first session. And one thing he had mentioned in conversations he's had with his friends and his wife is how there are many things that that can be learned from the immigrant community, not just Chinese immigrants, but we're even talking immigrants from Africa, and that usually typically is a very hardworking culture. That being said, though, however, he did remind me that, hey, guess what? Immigrants by choice come over here, and immigrants are most likely disproportionately hardworking, disproportionately smart subsets of the population of the country they came from. So you have that going for you. You have a shared culture, shared experience, shared food, shared support, whereas the African American experience, as you mentioned, Pastor Steven, is there's not very much of that. It's a shared history of slavery, and it's very hard to overcome that. So thanks for sharing. Next question.
My dad wanted me to be an electrical engineer. And he's
what was that, Julian?
I said my dad wanted me to be an electrical engineer, and he's an artist, but he's also an immigrant. And so, growing up, it was like you have to learn math, science, become an electrical engineer, buy me a MacBook, pay for my retirement, things like that.
So that's that immigrant mindset right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you bought him that MacBook yet?
You can ask him.
Hey, Julie, where was your father from? Which country?
Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Caribbean. Yeah.
Okay.
Next question is for Julian. Sorry, here we go. What's your reasoning behind coming to CEC if you had choice to go to a more multi-ethnic church that is designed to cater to your needs better? Do you feel called by God to be at CEC, and why?
Yeah, I could answer that. So yeah, in terms of calling, I do feel called to be at CEC right now. That's why I'm still attending at the moment. I mean, with anything in life, I do try to listen to God's calling at any given point in my life. And so these things might change over time. Obviously I moved from Austin into different churches along the way. And I'll just say, well, actually, when I got to San Diego, I didn't plan to go to a Chinese church. I specifically decided I'm actually not going to go to another Chinese church. I grew up in that enough. Not that I was turned off by it, but I just wanted something different, more diversity of experiences in my life. And I actually tried several other churches in San Diego. Something I was specifically looking for was a good young adult ministry. And so I was trying all these different churches. I wasn't quite finding that great fit. And then I mentioned my friend Kevin Wang. He didn't reach out himself, but another friend told me he was going to CEC. You should check it out. And I was like, no, I already told you. I try not to go to another Chinese church. I'm trying to get a little more diversity. But he kept asking me to go. And so I finally was like, yeah, I'll go if my friend who's not Christian will go with me. He's actually my roommate now. And then we went, and he was like, yeah, I'll go. So I was like, okay, I guess I better go now. And so I went, and I remember sitting down on Sunday waiting for it to start, and Austin Lim sat next to me. And if y'all know him, it probably makes sense what happened next. He invited me to young adult ministry and convinced me to keep checking out and keep going, and ended up staying. And so after some time, when I actually fully committed a few months later, that was a whole process with me and God figuring out, is this really the right fit? The young adult ministry was good, but I was having that internal conflict. And for me, I began to see what I was getting, especially at work, was a very different cultural experience. And so I was actually getting that diversity and being stretched in one way. And then I kind of needed something familiar to ground me a bit more. And so CEC is a familiar space to the church that I grew up in. That's what kind of drew me in and kept me to stay. But I will say there is a piece of a part of my like bigger life calling that I feel like God has revealed to me, that working in Asian American ministry, of course, like I said, majoring in Asian American studies, having my friend group being Asian American, I do feel like that's not by accident. There's a certain reasoning behind it. I won't go into my full story, but there were certain signs that kept leading me down this direction without really necessarily trying to take these steps towards this community. And so to me, that is a sign from God that that is the reason for me to be here, is that connection. At the same time, I'll be completely honest, there's like not a week, maybe not even a day that goes by where I don't question. I hear people saying, either very overtly or subtly that you don't belong, that you're different, that why are you here? I think that question, why are you here? Why are you here? I mean, there's an honest way and an earnest way to ask that question, but I've definitely been asked it in other ways, like, why don't you get out of here? Like, why are you still sticking around when, like, clearly you're not wanted in this space? And so that's always been a challenge. And I always have to come to God with that and try to reevaluate what's the next logical and healthy step for me. I also mentioned earlier that, identify as both gay and Christian. In a similar way, I've seen that same dichotomy of people asking me, why are you here? Or why are you sticking around? Even friends who go to very similar churches, CC, why are you staying there in this community when it's so hard to be in this space? And I think if there's anything that's true in my life that I've noticed, is like being different or being an outsider is actually what's more normal to me than fitting in, if that makes any sense. Like, I fit in by not fitting in a lot of ways. And so that's, I guess, what I'm used to. Some might say I'm doing it to punish myself, but I think it's just how I naturally interact with the world. If I fit in too well somewhere, I notice I get too complacent. And I think to me, that's a much more dangerous space to be in with myself, with my relationship with God, with my outlook in the world. And so, yeah, that's kept me coming.
Well, Julian, I want to say we appreciate having you at CEC. So I want you to always realize that. So I've served with you together on different things, and it's always been a pleasure. You have a great mind and a great insight. And so you've been, in my eyes, you're a blessing here. So just want to share that.
That's a great story. Thanks, Julian. I don't think I've heard that in its entirety before, and I appreciate your honesty, vulnerability, and the insight. I enjoyed hearing that. Thank you. Another one for you, Julian. Are there any questions that people in general or Asian Americans should avoid asking people who are Black? Or are there ways that are bad to phrase questions or phrase?
Are there any questions? Well, I mean, I'm not going to speak for the entire Black community, but some of the maybe common ones I hear are that I would not recommend saying are, is it okay to say the N-word? I mean, well, I shouldn't say, I don't think asking that is wrong, but saying it, trying to make a situation where you can say it, I think that's across the board probably unwise. Can you ask the question again? I want to make sure you asked about questions, or
It says, are there any questions that people or Asian Americans should avoid asking people who are Black? Or are there ways, maybe a little typo, but are there ways to better phrase certain questions? Or I guess it doesn't have to be questions. Maybe it could just be phrases. What you brought up, I think, is a great example.
Yeah. I mean, I think generally speaking, when talking to somebody who's Black or just somebody who's different than you and you're trying to learn, I mean, I would say before asking questions, just like I said, do that self-evaluation, that self-learning, look at your own reasons for asking these questions. I think that example I showed was like, if it's out of a motivation to just try to be able to do something, or maybe to get a rise out of the other person to try to make them angry or make them feel uncomfortable. I think those are wrong reasons to ask those questions, and they're not biblical reasons to ask those questions, not loving reasons to ask them. But doing that first self-evaluation and knowing what your intentions are of asking any questions, if it's coming from a truly honest learning place. And then I know for myself, I always like to give some context to the question before I'm going to ask it. Hey, this is why I'm doing it. Like, I'm not doing it for these other reasons, or at least as much as I know myself, I'm not doing it for these reasons, but I really just honestly want to learn. And I think also giving some space for, if you don't feel comfortable asking, that's totally fine. Or sorry, answering, that's totally fine. If, if this is triggering for you, which it sometimes is, then it's totally fine to not answer these questions. So I think the theme there is not making the question asking about you and about your own, just about yourself, but recognizing you are putting a burden on somebody else to maybe relive something, or to try to explain something that they don't, feel they have the authority to explain, or that they just don't want to talk about for whatever reason. So creating that safe space for them to respond and to feel like you're asking for the right reasons, and that you understand that this could be a burden on them. So it's totally fine for them to answer in the way that they choose, or just not answer at all. I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think a lot of African Americans in this country feel that way right now. I think a lot of our guests have said the same exact thing. It's emotionally draining, and as a way to serve the person you're asking, preface it exactly how you said it. What we're going to do is we're going to ask one.
My Black office hours on my Facebook. So Tuesdays and Thursdays. So it's fine to ask then.
There you go. There you go. We're going to do one more question. It's going to be for Pastor Steven, and then I'm going to end the session. However, the goal being done by 9. After that, we will officially end. But there's a few more good questions here that we'll if Julian and Pastor Steven are okay with it, we'll stay on and answer a few more. But we'll officially end in about 5-10 minutes here. So the last official question is for Pastor Steven. Pastor Steven, how do we become a church that welcomes all, and how should we react towards racism? Should we be rebuking it or avoiding the conflict? How do we do so in a Christian manner?
Yeah, I think as a church, I think this is the beginning of the dialogue. So I appreciate just all the different speakers and different things. And the best way to reach things is really through the pulpit. So maybe as a result of this, we can look at talking about it from the pulpit, and to make sure everybody in our, at least the English congregation, understands. We also need to bring it up to the elders to make sure that they're on board too. And just knowing our elders, I think all of them would agree that this is something that we're not going to stand for. I think the tricky part is, especially for Cantonese and Mandarin speaking, is what does this mean for me? Can I not reach Cantonese and Mandarin speaking? And I don't believe that's what we're saying, but I think it's just really having us realize that we want to be a church that blesses all, welcomes all, the way that Christ did. And so figuring that out. And so I think there's more things we need to do to become that church. And so I don't have an exact answer to that, but that's something that I know we are talking a little bit about. I know Jimmy's talked to the EMT about, like, what are things we can do to reach out more, to be more broad than what we are. And I think it's an ongoing dialogue and conversation that's going to happen. So just like Julian talked about, it isn't like something right now we can go, ta-da, we got the answer. Racism still exists in America. It hasn't been solved. I mean, it's like we don't have like the special bullet, the magic bullet that does it, the silver bullet. So, but I believe that if our hearts are willing and we work together at it, I think we will make progress. And I think it's like Julian said, it's this iterative process that we need to go through. And I expect to see more of that in the near future.
Yeah, the learn, repent, reconcile, reflect. So I think that's something we all can be doing internally on an individual basis. And then as a church, when we're looking to have a more, group response, we'll be looking to Pastor Steven to continue to set the tone on it, just as you've done tonight, Pastor Steven. I definitely want to thank everyone involved for tonight, Pastor Steven, Julian, and everyone behind the scenes AV-wise. That includes not just this session, but our last three. I did want to end with an encouragement for all of us. This topic is nuanced. It's heavily influenced by our own personal backgrounds and experiences, by media, just consciously, subconsciously. There's so many angles, so many experiences, so many opinions. Christ, though, does not command us to always fully agree. Rather, he does command us to bear with one another in love. We believe that as Christians, each of us have God's Spirit, his presence with us. Therefore, we can listen to one another, not listen to respond, but rather continue to listen to hear. We can also therefore disagree and yet still deeply care for one another. The church is so much richer when it's not a monolith, whether racially, politically, or generationally. So as such, my encouragement for all of us is as we continue to buckle up for the long haul and enter in these hard conversations, we want to do it with love, which means putting the needs and concerns of others before our own. And we can do that because of Jesus, and because we know that final justice is found in him, and we have the grace and strength that is provided to us through him as well. So I'd like to close this in a quick word of prayer, and we'll officially end for tonight. And if you'd like to stay on to hear a few more questions, then you can. So let me pray for us. God, you are King, you are sovereign. The world around us, this is a historic moment in our country, and things are just unbelievably complex and crazy right now. But God, you say that you are outside of time even, that you have known us and known everything going on since before time began. And so we can trust in you. And you're not just a God who is just so far away from us, but you are also near to us as well. You know the number of hairs on our head. Not a bird can fall from the sky without you knowing. And so we trust you as King over all creation, and we also trust you in our hearts, and we worship you, and we look to you for hope, we look to you for peace, we look to you for justice. Thank you for Jesus, who has paid the penalty for our sins on our behalf. Thank you that we can approach you with confidence, and we can find rest and peace in you. Would you bring rest to our restless souls and to our society, to our country, and to our world? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.